Welcome. Welcome back to yet another video. Today's video is about Spring Boot, how it internally works. In this video, we are going to explain, we are going to dive into how Spring Boot works and how your application runs internally, right? And what are the secrets behind the Spring Boot and its internal mechanism and the workflow. So all this is explained in this video. If you are looking out for a video who explains what is Spring Boot and what exactly the internal things which happens internally, right? So this video is for those people and also people who are looking out for videos on Spring Boot. This video will be helpful. So without wasting the time, let's look at it. So basically, if you have heard of Spring Boot, right? So prior to that, if you are been working for a long time, you must have already heard about Spring Framework, right? Now, uh, Spring Boot basically it is built on the top of the Spring Framework. Now, that is the reason it is simplifies your Java development, right? And it provides production ready configuration. It actually can create your standalone applications, which is self-contained Spring Boot application. So that is what Spring Boot is about. So it's an combination of Spring Framework, and top of that, it gives you an easy and simplified way of developing your application. So that's what it is. The Spring Boot is about. Now, overall, let's understand what is the architecture. Now, Spring Boot as an application, right? Internally, it relies on several other components, right? It depends on different components, and all together, which forms their architecture. Now, if you look at it, these the internal components are there. Like one is Spring application context, right? So if you have been working for a Spring framework, right, you must have heard of the application context, right? So one of them is Spring application context. Second is Spring Boot auto configuration. Now, this is one of the important. We'll look further like what exactly this auto configuration is about. Thirdly, there is an embedded server. So basically, you must have heard like if you have your Spring Boot application or Spring application which you have developed, what you have to do is that earlier prior you used to develop that, you have to build that, and then explicitly you have to deploy it, right? So here in Spring Boot you have an explicit embedded web server. Now, Spring Boot starter dependency, basically this is one of the important and the key feature where it resolves your all implicit dependencies and transitive dependencies, right? So you doesn't have to manually search for the dependencies which will work, what is a compatible version and all these things, right? So the architecture wise, this is overall the components, right? Now, as we already discussed the components, right? What is, when it comes to Spring Boot application, right? So the very first thing is Spring Boot main application. Now, if you have your main application, now in Java, the application which has got the main class is the main application, right? So main class. So every Spring Boot application also there will be a starting point where this particular application will start. That is the main class. Now this typically will have the annotation that is at the rate Spring Boot application, right? And internally, if you look at it, right, this is itself a combination of three annotations. One is at the rate configuration, at the rate enable auto configuration, and at the rate component scan. Now we'll look one by one about this, like what exactly it is. So now when you look at the at the rate configuration, this will mark that particular class as a source of bean definition, right? So this will have certain configuration which can be looked and then can be loaded at the runtime, right? So all the bean definition which it requires, right, it will have this particular configuration. Now enable auto configuration, which will enable your auto configuration mechanism. So it will auto configure whatever it is finding in the class path, right? Libraries. Now at the rate component scan, it will scan all your class path, right? With all if it is there is a bean defined, like it will check for all those particular beans. It will load that from the class path and then basically from certain packages whichever is defined in the at the rate component scan, right? that it will scan that particular whole package and sub packages. Now, as I mentioned, the in that Spring Boot application, there will be an application dot run which will invoke a Spring application dot run which will be invoked using the main method. Now, this particular method will start your application Spring context. It will bootstrap your application. It will also start your embedded server, which is by default Tomcat. You can configure it to some other server as well. Okay. Now, the second point is like as I mentioned, Spring application dot run. Now, this is one of the core and important of the Spring Boot startup framework, right? So, in this method, basically, there is lot of things which is happening, a lot of work it does. First, it does the initialization of the Spring environment. Second, it does initializing of the Spring application context. Now, third, it actually configures your embedded server, whichever it is, Tomcat or Jetty for by default, whatever you have configured for, right, for your application. Apart from after that, it will actually scan all those like at the rate component, at the rate configuration annotated beans or the classes, and it will load them into the context, right? And then after that, it will trigger the auto configuration, which is there based on the classpath libraries and other details classes mentioned, right? After this, the auto configuration. So last time, whatever we discussed, the auto configuration process. Now in this, it will actually, you can consider this as some kind of an internal process which will be internally taken care. Now, Spring Boot has an ability for minimizing your configuration, so you doesn't have to do explicit lot of configuration which was earlier in the Spring framework you have to do, right? Now, what actually Spring Boot it does is that it look for the classes in the classes path, and then it actually configure your application automatically based on whatever the libraries it founds or like whichever it detects in the application, right? The class path. Now, example, let's say you have an S2 database, right? That is detected in your class path. Now, what Spring Boot will do, it will automatically configure your in-memory database, right? It will configure all the libraries and other details like, and then it will make it available to you, right? Internally, when you Spring Boot, what exactly it does is that it will at the rate enable configuration is there, it will load all the configuration that is relevant to that particular library is found in that particular class path. So all the relevant things will be loaded. Now this can be found in the meta inf spring.factory files, which is itself a list of auto configuration classes, right? So you will find all that particular details in that particular file. Now, if you look at the fourth component, that is bean initialization and the dependency injection. Now, if you have known, like Spring Framework is popularly known for its dependency injection and IOC container, right? So, centrally, all the beans, right, which are there for the core thing, it like the dependency injection, right? It's a central part of it. So it will manage all this life cycle of the bean, like creation, initialization, destroyation, like whatever the application context does, right? Now, Spring Boot also uses a component scanning, which will automatically scan all the beans which are marked like annotation at the red component, service, repository, controller, anything whichever it is marked with the annotation, it will scan it and it will load that, right? Now internally the container, the Spring container, there is a bean factory which will manage its life cycle for like creation and then like all those like life cycle processes for that particular bean. Now when your application is getting started, the Spring Boot actually will create the beans, it will inject the dependencies whatever it is there, the supportive the beans it is required to define, and then it will load them according to the configuration which is defined in it, right? uh, so now when we look at the Spring Boot auto configuration, now this is one of the important and the most crucial feature of Spring Boot. So it will do the auto configuration, right? This is based on the annotation what we define. So that is, as we already spoke, at the rate Spring Boot application is combination of three annotation. Now auto configuration will, what will it will do, it will try to do an attempt of configuring your application whatever it finds libraries in your present class path. So it checks for properties, it for checks for the configuration at the configuration classes, and then it applies those configuration automatically. Now, as we already discussed for the S2 things, let's say in your application is started, right, and it checks if certain classes like data source, JDBC template, which are existing in your class path, this will automatically configure your beans and for that particular database and then data access things, right? So it will make your application available to with those particular libraries which are required and the set of classes which are required to run those things, right? That's the, I would say, the brain it has. So it will automatically detect what it can be required. Now, any application what has been developed, right? It requires certain environment to run, right? So whether it is web server, application server, or whatever it is, right? So it requires to run that. Now, Spring Boot itself has given a embedded server, which is, you doesn't need to explicitly configure it, right? If you doesn't configure it, automatically what it does is that by default, whatever the Tomcat is there, it will deploy in that particular application. Your application can be run in it, right? So it often comes with an embedded server which is default, that is Tomcat. But if you doesn't want that particular default thing, you can configure you can exclude the Tomcat, you can include certain Jetty or any other application or the web server, right? So traditionally, when you are doing the Spring MVC application, where you have to manually configure this particular web app server, you have to embed those particular directly within your application, right? That's how it saves you your time and the effort, right? So Spring Boot will automatically detect the dependencies which is there in the class path, and it will configure Tomcat or Jetty. So automatically configuring the server and making run your application along with that life cycles, right? Let's say your application is configured on 8080, right? It will start your application on the server, that is, it will listen to that particular HTTP port, and that is, let's say, 8080, right? So it will run on that particular server. Now, there are two things. One is command liner and one is application runner. These are the interfaces. Basically, these are the interfaces provided with the Spring Boot. So, which will kind of execute your code at your application startup only. Okay. So there are, if let's say you want certain features, certain things to be initiated or certain things to be loaded at the start of your application, then you can implement this particular interface, these two interfaces, and you can do your work. So when you implement the command line interface, it can run after your application context has been initialized, basically, right? So whatever things whatever you want to do after your application initialization, then I mean application context has been initialized, you can run it, you can write your code over it. Now the application runner, this is similar to that particular command liner, but what happens is that it gives you much more access to the particular application arguments, right? So if your bean is implementing either using this particular any of these particular interfaces, it will invoke the run method using the after your application context has been initialized. So basic, that is the idea. Whatever you wanted to get run after your application is initialized, your context is initialized, you can implement this interface and get it run. Now, if you look at the bean lifecycle, right, Spring Boot also has got their own lifecycle of their application. So there are phases, right? So one is initialization process, which will totally initialize your Spring Boot application, that is by running the Spring Boot and then run method, right? So application context, environment variable things actually are set up over here. Your whatever properties are there for the applications are loaded over here. Then comes the phase of bean creation process. Now it will scan your beans, it will create the bean factory or application whatever it is, the factory, right? Dependencies are injected in the beans, whatever there is the interdependency, right? Based on the configuration what we define. Now, if you want to, now what happens is that you have to run that particular, the phase comes is running your things. So your application starts, the embedded server is launched over there, HTTP request can serve your request over there. let's say 800 8000 or 880 you have configured, right? So your application will be up, it is able to take the request and then it will provide you the responses, right? Your application is completely up. Now then comes application shutdown phase. That is whenever the application is stopped or for certain some reason, right, it will gracefully shut down your embedded server itself, and then it will do the cleanup activities like cleaning up the resources, the memory, and whatever the web server, the application loads up, right? That's how. So we have discussed like what are the when we compare your Spring MVC application along with the Spring Boot application, here is the differences. How it is easy in your development and also the other things, right? So when it comes to configuration in Spring MVC, you used to manually configure those or using the XML or Java, but in Spring Boot you can automatically configure them. Server startup, now you need an external server, but in Spring Boot you doesn't need an external. It's an embedded one. Deployment wise, if you already saw like a war file was required or jar file whatever, then you have to deploy in the external thing. But this jar file, this can be immediately either a standalone application can be run in it, right? Dependencies, now you have to manually do the research, you have to manually check what is compatible, and then you do the dependency management. But Spring Boot actually does the auto dependency management using the starter framework, right? So application initialization, it requires a lot of boilerplate code which is unnecessary. But Spring Boot application, actually it requires to it will run your application with a minimal things, with a minimal setup. Now annotation, basically we already discussed this, like whatever the main class is marked as a at the rate Spring Boot application, that's the main class. And although internally it is taken care, but this is the combination of all this particular annotation, which is a single annotation over here. uh, so I hope in some I was able to explain the internal things, whatever it is happening in the Spring Boot, and how internally it loads the beans, configure it, then how it deploys it, then how the distillation happens, right? What are the what are the things you can do after your application context is done, so it is one of the simplest form of I would say the application development you can do by you is using the configuration. It allows developer to put their brain on like the business logic instead of application setup for configuration, and then they spend their time. So you have auto configuration, embedded server, easy dependency management features, which is a boon to the developer and make your life easy, right? So that's what it Spring Boot does, and it is designed to make your application development faster and easy and production ready. So I hope this video was helpful to you and was able to explain you in depth about what is how internally the Spring Boot application works and what are the annotations, right? And what are the secrets behind the internal mechanism about it, right? If this video was helpful, please do share it with other needy people who are looking out for such videos. And please do like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Thank you for